Good afternoon. On behalf of the Chair, Department of History and Archaeology, I want to invite you all in this ongoing series that has been going on under the broad theme of histories of contested spaces, expropriation, governance, and post-colonial modernity in Kenya. We have both those who are physically here present with us, and we also have those who are joining us online. Good mornings, good afternoons, good evenings, depending on your time zone. And welcome to the series. Today's topic is all the dictators' men, elite management, and loyalty in Moi's Kenya. Our presenter today is Andrew Wojtanik. Andrew is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California-Berkeley. He holds a Bachelor of Science in International Politics from Georgetown University, and this research focuses on elite politics and regime decision-making in East Africa. And since both the East African community and what is geographically referred to as Eastern Africa is now so wide, Andrew has made it clear that when he's talking of East Africa, he's talking of the original East Africa of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Andrew will have 1 hour to present. Then I, as the moderator, will have 10 to 15 minutes. Then we shall open it up for both who are physically present and those following online to ask their questions as well as give their comments. And therefore, without further ado, Andrew, you can take the floor.
All right, is this working okay? Can you hear me all right? Perfect. Thank you kindly for the introduction, Dr. Olo. And thank you to Professor Mbongi as well for the kind invitation, and to the Department of History and Archaeology here at the University of Nairobi. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to present to you my project, which is notionally called All the Dictator's Men, Elite Management and Loyalty in Moi's Kenya. And it's part of a broader dissertation research. I'm only a PhD candidate. I haven't gotten my PhD yet. That focuses on the internal politics of dictatorship in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But for brevity's sake, today I'm only going to present a portion of the project, which advances a theory of political loyalty and defection in Moi's Kenya. So in other words, what I'm really excited about is that I'm excited to take you on a journey into the room where it happens, sort of the internal politics of an authoritarian regime, where I think we all have a curiosity of what goes on behind closed doors in these cutthroat environments, where backstabbing can sometimes be literal and where rivalry and competition is fierce. So I'm using some evidence I've collected from Moi's Kenya to talk about dictatorship generally, but also to hopefully glean some new insights from Kenya itself. I'm trying to make sure I keep track of time here. So, all right, let's go. Should we go to the next slide here? Yeah, go for it. Thanks so much. First of all, I just want to acknowledge again, thank you for all the support from the faculty and staff here at the University of Nairobi, as well as the British Institute for Eastern Africa, with which I'm affiliated, and then the many, many others here in Kenya who helped make this project possible. A few disclaimers up front. First of all, I just want to note that the views expressed here are my own, do not necessarily represent the views of any organization that I'm affiliated with, including UC Berkeley, the University of Nairobi, the US government, or many others. Secondly, I approach this project or this presentation with a good deal of humility and modesty, and that is this is a work in progress. Many of people in the room here know far more about this project or about this time period than I will ever learn. So in a way, I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback. You can tell me where I'm wrong, where I need to change things, where the project could be improved. And finally, this, as I said, I'm a political scientist, so that reflects slightly different perspective, I think, from potential others in the room who come from history or anthropology or economics or literature. And I'm interested in the Q&A that I think some of the differences might actually reflect some of these different perspectives. But this is unabashedly a political science perspective. Okay, let's go to the next one. Just very briefly here to give an outline of what this talk will look like. I'm first going to present for about 15 to 20 minutes or so a general theory of political loyalty and defection under autocracy. Then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time going into the case study, I think that we're most interested in, which is looking at elite dynamics under President Moi. And then finally, I'm going to present some conclusions and some sort of areas of further research that I'm going into, which then we can maybe discuss further in the Q&A. Great, so just to introduce the subject, I'm interested in ruling elites under autocracy. And why am I interested in this group of people? I start from the premise that no dictator, no matter how powerful, rules alone. Behind every strongman, there are political operators, power brokers, and agents of repression who are both essential to the autocrat's survival and oftentimes the key players in their demise. Next slide, please. In other words, these ruling elites who serve under the dictator himself, who I define as the regime's top position holders, such as ministers, top party officials, legislators, top judicial officials, and top administrators in the civil service, serve essential functions to maintaining these dictatorships. Loyal and unified elites are necessary to, I broke this down into sort of plain speak and political science speak. For those of you with that political science inclination, we talk a lot about things about how elite cohesion is required for regime stability or to good governance or to state capacity. But I like to prefer the plain speak here and simply say that dictators require people around them who can loyally mobilize popular support, help them win elections if there are elections in the state, contain opposition parties and other threats that emerge from external sources from outside the regime itself. And to help, obviously, on the corollary here is they help contain insider threats, such as the threat of a coup from inside your own party or inside your own government. Beyond just political survival, these people who work in the administration themselves are also essential for designing and implementing policies, and they are given responsibility for managing the economy, foreign relations, and other critical governing institutions. And then finally, for those of you from more security persuasion, military and security elites are obviously essential for fighting wars, crime, and insecurity. So the problem here is that elites depend on these, or dictators depend on these types of elites, but their loyalty and cohesion is not assured. Some dictators, some dictatorships have unified and cohesive ruling elite coalitions, while others are historically fractious or prone to collapse. And just to give I'm not going to get too much into the cross-national comparison, but just to give you a flavor of this, consider, for example, the founding leaders of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. All of these states are gaining independence roughly around the same time, and they quickly become one-party states, right, where political competition, or de facto or de jure one-party states, where political competition against the ruling party is heavily circumscribed, and civil liberties are heavily circumscribed. So they all share this sort of broad category of what I would call an authoritarian regime, but there's dramatic differences in the administration and decision-making processes within these three states. So on one hand, for example, we have Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, who throughout his tenure was actually quite successful in maintaining the loyalty and cohesion of elites. He suffered relatively few defections relative to other states, which is in quite contrast to Uganda under Milton Obote, who suffers from the very beginning disloyalty from the elites who were around him in his party that resulted in overt attempts to try to displace him as the president of Uganda. Somewhere in between, we probably have Kenya under Jomo Kenyatta, who also, like Julius Nyerere, inherits a relatively strong position and has a good degree of elite loyalty, but still suffers some episodes, such as the 1966 defections, where we see elites taking action against KANU and against Kenyatta. So the point here is that countries that have still similar, somewhat similar background, historical backgrounds, and are broadly fall under this category of authoritarian regimes, still have very different elite dynamics. And so actually go back to the first slide here, please. Thank you. So what I've described here, though, is that I want to break this down into sort of two parts. We can think of the question in terms of a system level, in which the unit of analysis is a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime or a leader itself. And we can compare across those cases. We can compare countries and dictatorships. But I also in this talk want to talk about the individual level. And what I mean by this is that even within the same country, in the same context, and at the same time period, say, for example, the beginning of multi-party politics in Kenya in 1992, we see that some elites remain loyal to the regime while others disobey or defect. Now, I'm quite interested in this question of this individual level variation of why we get some defections and some loyalists. Okay, next slide, please. So before going on, I want to define loyalty and defection for you so that we can be clear through the talk. To me, a dictator to a dictator, a loyal subordinate or a loyal ruling elite is one who reliably follows orders, who carries them out with enthusiasm, and reliably comes to the leader's defense, even in times of crisis. These dedicated loyalists may view an alternative leadership as undesirable or even unfathomable or unthinkable in their mind. They remain steadfast in the face of temptations to desert and are willing to bear costs to their own personal reputation or political future in order to protect the dictator. These reliable subordinates accept demotions or removal of privileges without protest and subordinate their own ideological or policy preferences to that of the leader himself. Now, this does not mean that loyal elites necessarily, they can't disagree with the dictator. In fact, I think a leader's most trusted associates may have leeway to privately debate with the leader without fear of reproach. What matters most, however, is that once a decision is agreed upon, that this model elite faithfully defends and advances it without question. Overall, this definition helps to distinguish true loyalty, what I'm calling sort of an intrinsic loyalty, from mere sycophancy, or this artificial loyalty in which elites publicly avow loyalty, but behind closed doors are not so loyal to the leader. And another part about this intrinsic loyalty or instinctual loyalty is that it is not bought or coerced through some form of transaction or sanction, some material sanction. It sort of transcends the need for some sort of material bargain that keeps this relationship together. All right, next slide, please. The opposite of loyalty in this talk is what I'm calling disobedience or defection. So I'm defining defection here, which you'll hear a lot in this talk, as instances in which regime-affiliated elites take action to directly challenge the continued rule of the incumbent leader. So this could take several different forms. In some cases, it's an overt coup in which a threat emerges from the inside. Could be an impeachment or a no-confidence vote. In Kenya, as I will talk, it most often took the form of an opposition party, of creating or joining an existing opposition party after the advent of multi-party politics in 1992. Or it could take a form of an insurgency where an elite leads the coalition and initiates armed struggle. While the specifics of these can be unique, what they all share is that they are all overt breaches of the leader-subordinate relationship and reflect a desire by these ruling elites to replace the sitting dictator. All right, next slide, please. So the question is, how do leaders induce this elite loyalty and avoid disobedience and defection? So the existing literature in political science offers some explanations here. One influential approach, which is rooted in the rational choice tradition, emphasizes the role of material incentives, such as patronage or fear, or a system of rewards or sanctions. This reflects, sort of African politics is oftentimes called neo-patrimonialism or a clientelist logic. That's in which plum postings or rent-seeking opportunities are doled out to elites to buy their loyalty. Or inversely, instead of an inducement or a carrot, if you will, there's a stick. There's a system of punishments or sanctions, so fear induces loyalty. A key feature of this explanation, whether it's patronage or fear, is that the relationship is based on some expectation of a concrete transaction, sanction, or exchange. It's this material tie that induces elite loyalty under this explanation. Now, secondly, I have a second alternative approach that has been common in the literature, which is similar to the material incentives, but instead of arguing that loyalty comes from this internal system of patronage and fear, it's the result of external shocks to the regime. So by external shock, I mean something like a crisis moment, like an economic downturn or a popular uprising or disputed election, a civil war, or more broadly, the broader change in the international landscape that facilitated liberalization across much of the world in the early 1990s. So the argument here is that these crisis moments offer opportunities for ruling elites to defect without recourse, that make it more likely that they're going to defect. So together, these two explanations, what I think they get right is that they emphasize the self-interested calculus of many politicians in these regimes. And there's no shortage of cases in Kenya or elsewhere of political opportunism that I think well explains this. But a closer examination, I think, reveals some challenges to both of these approaches. And this is where I hope to insert my sort of my contribution. First of all, even if we take on a regime level where we compare dictatorships across countries, we see that defection rates vary widely across these dictatorships, even when they face analogous colonial backgrounds, analogous demographic profiles, similar regime crises, or general macrostructural conditions. So it's not that these macrostructural conditions aren't important, but they are insufficient to explain the variation in the outcomes. For example, to use a case outside of Africa, I guess Northern Africa and the Middle East, we saw during the Arab Spring that a number of regimes faced a similar bouts of popular unrest. It's a similar crisis. And yet, dictators in Bahrain and Syria maintained the loyalty of elites, while those in Egypt and Tunisia did not. So this analogous case of similar regime crises is insufficient to explain this variation. So moreover, it's not just at the regime level that these explanations struggle, but they also struggle to explain the individual level. Even within the same time period, in the same country, in the same set of circumstances, we see some defect and others do not. So the question is, why is that the case? And I think these existing explanations are not sufficient in helping us understand that. Finally, and relatedly, I think the existing explanations that assume the supremacy of rational calculations based on material incentives likely underestimate the degree to which non-material factors shape elite decisions. Put plainly, how trustworthy is an elite really if I have to keep buying them off or I have to keep scaring them in order to keep them loyal? I think this is not the type of intrinsic loyalty that I was talking about. That's not tied to a material transaction. So I'll argue that these non-material factors are actually help explain some of these deviations and some of these variation. The next slide, please. Thank you. So what do I mean by non-material influences? I argue in general that politics in nearly all contexts, and especially in these dictatorships, is both social and historical. By social, I mean that even in autocratic regimes, where politics is notoriously cutthroat, ruling elites are still human beings. They're not necessarily rational choice automatons making calculations purely based on expected material gains. Rather, they're embedded in networks of relationships, of interpersonal relationships, that in turn influence their beliefs, preferences, choices, and actions. One of the takeaways from the many interviews I did with former Moi-era officials here in Kenya was the vital importance of personal ties in underpinning political alliances, protecting elites in times of need, and producing mutual understanding that is the true basis for survival in administration under autocracy. As an example, I spoke with Dr. Sally Kosgei, who was a top civil servant in Moi's government, and she told me that this kind of networking based on interpersonal relationships is much more powerful than merely tribe or other strategic considerations. It's these personal relationships, these direct ties that oftentimes influence politics. Now, by historical, I mean that robust relationships cannot be developed overnight easily. They require time and investment. So I expect that relationships and alliances, in fact, that are rooted in a common bond that predates the issue at hand, or even predates the entry of both sides into politics itself, is the most durable and the most likely to induce cohesion. I think this is not just something we find in politics, but in everyday life. All of us, I think, fall back sometimes on the friends that we knew from our early formative experiences in life. In fact, the interviews that I conducted here in Kenya reaffirmed this idea that a number of ministers I spoke with suggested that their early childhood, early schooling, or early professional careers laid the basis for the political alliances that they then had when they were in power. For example, I spoke with a Kamba minister, Titus Mbathi, who's now 95 years old, I believe, but has worked under both Jomo Kenyatta and Moi. And he told me that his strong working relationship with Tom Mboya and Moi Kibaki, for example, was due to their, quote, shared values and background as classmates, dating all the way back to Mangu High School. So it's an example, and there's many others that I can come up with here, where the most durable political relationships date to early in life. I put up a little diagram here just for fun, where we can imagine the blue being like sort of the president or the dictator, and the yellow being the people who serve under them. And I just put this up here to reinforce the point that all of these individuals are embedded in a social network, a network of ties in which they're taking cues from one another, both from the dictator and from each other. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Terrific. So there's a lot of different things. These networks are infinitely complex. And so I'm not going to try to make too many generalized claims about them. What I'm going to only give you is a modest prediction about how network ties affect loyalty and defection. And that's that I expect that ruling elites who have existing personal relationships or common backgrounds with the dictators they serve should, on average, defect less often than elites who lack such ties. So I can break this down into two types. One that I'm calling a thick form of social endowment, meaning by this I mean a direct and recurring acquaintance between the dictator and the elite that is based on a long-standing basis. So some examples of this might be that the pair of them are direct familial kin through blood or through marriage. They could be former schoolmates, neighbors, longtime business partners, contemporaries from the same military unit in the past, from the same social club or another association. Some scholars in both history and political science have suggested that shared participation in violent struggle or revolution produces especially intense bonds of interpersonal solidarity or shared destiny in mutual loyalty. So these are some examples of direct personal relations that I'm calling sort of thick ties. But I also point to the importance of a thinner form of social endowment. And this is in which ruling elites may not be directly acquainted with each other in the past, but they still share some common features that facilitate mutual understanding. One case is co-ethnicity, I think, but I don't want to just point to tribe or ethnicity as an important factor here. It could also be coming from the same home region. There could be the idea that they are from the same generation or similar age. They could have gone to the same school at different times, but have the same level of educational attainment and therefore a similar identity. Or they may have come from the same prior occupation. They were former teachers or lawyers, and that gives sort of an affinity toward one another. There's a really good term in sociology that's called homophily, which in short and well put is like attracts like. It's the idea that individuals have the tendency to gravitate toward and behave similarly toward those with whom they have shared attributes, a phenomenon that I think explains much of the human condition and not just this context. So we'll see homophily in this idea of common backgrounds in addition to direct personal ties or thick ties playing a role in the story I'm about to tell. Okay, next slide, please. So how does this all work in practice? Why should we expect social ties between leaders and elites to produce greater loyalty and reduce the likelihood of defection? Here I propose 3 stories or 3 mechanisms for why we might expect this to be true. First, I'm calling this interpersonal trust and mutual obligation, in which shared histories engender closeness and they place social sanctions on defection. So a shared history here increases a sense of that if the relationship is breached, it would be an incredible betrayal of a long-standing relationship and is therefore something to be avoided. Those who share a personal history of mutual assistance in times of need may accumulate personal debts to one another that are difficult to shed. And they may also be more likely to take risks or make personal sacrifices on behalf of the person with which they're connected than actors that only have a purely material exchange-based relation. So this is one mechanism, and I'll explain more about this later in the Moi, when we get into the Moi case study. The second I'm calling information flows. And this is the idea that there's a downside to strong interpersonal attachments, and that's that it sometimes closes off outside sources of information. It tends to mean that people get the information from only in their close cluster of people with which they're familiar and for which they have shared attributes, which leads to what we might call sort of an information bubble that is hard to breach. And this leads them to make what might be, seemingly in retrospect, an irrational calculation, or a calculation in which their material gain is actually eroded, or their material benefit in the future is actually worse off than what it had been before. As an illustration, if we're thinking about if there's an active coup attempt in a country, officials whose networks are composed primarily of defectors who are participating in the coup are likely to receive strong signals that the coup is popular and thus likely to succeed. And so they are therefore more likely to join the coup attempt. But conversely, elites surrounded by loyalists, however, are more likely to see the coup attempt as likely to fail. The problem is their social circle may not be representative of the entire objective number of people who are deciding whether the coup is likely to succeed or fail. So we see where this closed off information based on shared attachments can lead to these sort of unexpected or political mistakes. Finally, the third factor is delegation of authority. What I mean by this is that we should expect allies who have shared social ties will be given greater autonomy and greater responsibility and greater power than those who are outside the social circle or outside or are not maintaining social ties with the dictator. So this first group will enjoy special privileges. They'll have ability to make their autonomous decisions on their own, or may have the ability to even speak back to the dictator or to challenge their own policies without fear of reproach. But the same level of privileges is not given to this other group of people who don't share social ties with the leader and are therefore subjected to what we might call micromanagement, or a constant interference by the dictator in that subordinate's affairs. In this case, dictators may routinely overrule them, make announcements without consulting them, or intentionally try to undermine the ruling elite. These different experiences in turn affect loyalty. And I think that we should expect that those that have better experiences and are treated better by the leader will be less likely to defect, while those who are micromanaged are more likely to do so. In simply, I think it's a simple but profound point, we might say that how you feel about the dictator and whether you should stay loyal depends on who you are and how you've been treated. But that how you've been treated is directly related to how much the leader trusts you based on these past social ties. Together, these three mechanisms, I think, help us explain why social ties help explain differences in whether some elites stay loyal while others defect. All right, next slide, please. And this is the final theory section before we can move on to Moi, which will be great. Finally, just a few caveats and clarifications, which we can get to in the Q&A further if you'd like. That's it. First, the specific relevant identities here in social ties are definitely going to vary by context. We might not, it would be unfair to generalize, I think, across context that one identity is supreme. And there might also be overlapping identities where people have several shared qualities, say ethnicity and education and age, that may then further reinforce loyalty. So I want to be careful about overgeneralizing too much. Secondly, it doesn't necessarily mean that ruling coalitions under autocracy will be homogeneous. So I still think dictators in almost any setting will face significant pressures to try to have a diverse and representative administration. But within this constraint, I still think that dictators will try to choose based on this homophily, or choose to surround themselves by people who are similar to them. And finally, I think all of us can probably think of examples in Kenya or around the world of fallouts between long-standing friends and allies. And I don't disagree that this can happen. But I do think that they're much less likely probabilistically on average than those who don't have shared social ties. And I think these long-standing allies may be treated differently and more likely to be rehabilitated and brought back into the regime after the defection. Okay, so with those caveats out of the way, let's get into the fun part, which is the case study. I'll first present sort of the methods that I took. And I will start by saying it's not easy to study dictatorships. I think that's a pretty uncontroversial statement. For example, if I wanted to go to a contemporary dictatorship, and if I said I wanted to go to Russia, for example, and ask Vladimir Putin, hey, what happened to Yevgeny Prigozhin? And what's going on in the internal dynamics in your regime? I would probably be kicked out of the country immediately. So it's very difficult to study contemporary or today's dictatorships. But a way around this is studying historical autocracies. By this, I mean regimes that used to be authoritarian, but have since liberalized, and Kenya being an example, where time has passed, offering access to potential written records and archives, as well as the possibility for oral histories from living members of that former regime. So this is the approach I take. I obviously love history for history's sake, but there's also a practical advantage of taking this approach as well. In this talk, I'm going to highlight 4 primary sources of information. The first is that I took a little bit, because I'm a political scientist and American political science love quantitative data, I put a little bit of quantitative data in here. And that's that I've collected basic biographical data on all 120 cabinet ministers who served under President Moi, including facts about their political history, personal background attributes such as age, ethnicity, occupational history, etc. And most importantly, whether or not they stayed loyal or defected during Moi's 24-year rule. In addition to this quantitative data, I rely on 3 sources of qualitative data or qualitative records. The first is archives, of course, where I've spent time in the Kenyan National Archives, examined Kenyan newspapers like the Daily Nation, East Africa Standard, and Weekly Review, and then spent some time in the British National Archives. And for the last one, you might think that the British Archives would not be super useful for this because it reflects sort of an outsider perspective. But what's really interesting about this is that if you delve into the British archives, there's a number of times where you find private declassified cables of Kenyan politicians privately telling British diplomats what's going on inside the regime. And sometimes they're even signaling that they're about to defect or that they are discontented with Moi's regime. And so there's these little tidbits that I think we could call primary sources that still come up in the British archives that are quite interesting. But if the archives aren't enough, I try to complement this with two other sources. The first is, given the proliferation of, or the passing of time and the proliferation of Kenyan publishers nowadays, we've seen a lot of new elite memoirs and assisted biographies from former Moi-era insiders talking about their experiences. And some of them are quite frank, revealing a lot about the personal and political networks in which they operated. And then finally, in the bulk of my talk, we'll actually be drawing on more than 24 in-person interviews that I had with former ministers and senior civil servants who worked under President Moi. A lot of these conversations, and I hope to do more in the future, a lot of these conversations lasted a matter of hours, allowing for detailed discussion of what was going on at the time. And they reflect a variety of different backgrounds, spanning all the major ethnic groups of Kenya and many others, and a mix of defectors and loyalists. So people from different traditions, different backgrounds, to help sort of tease out the idea of these background factors influencing their decisions. So I'm gonna cover the case study in sort of two parts. First, briefly at the system level, where I'm talking about in general, in aggregate, in broad strokes, the position that Moi inherited, and then what his leadership strategy and leadership and management style was like during his rule. But I want to spend a lot of the time on the individual level, where we zoom in on specific individual cases of ministers and civil servants who worked under President Moi to try to understand their calculus. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, given the importance of what I was saying, sort of the historical inherited elite network building that was involved in many of these regimes, I think it's good to start with what Moi's inheritance looked like when he first came to power in August 1978. What were his advantages and disadvantages? What was the state of cohesion, elite loyalty at this time? And here I'll briefly talk about the advantages. First of all, he clearly had sufficient support to withstand a number of challenges to his succession. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Change the Constitution movement back when Moi was vice president, where a significant chunk of the ruling elite preferred an alternative candidate. But Moi had sufficient allies to be able to withstand this challenge and assume the presidency. Secondly, he had some longstanding ties to former KANU cadres who were with him from the beginning when KANU was a separate party at independence, and he maintained some relationships with these. He was also, at least at the beginning, relatively popular with the public. I included this picture here of him raising a rock and contributing to a road gabion, which exemplifies Moi's willingness to get his hands dirty, literally, and going into to meet with people on the streets, which certainly earned him some popularity. And this was an advantage. And then finally, one of his tactical advantages was popularizing the Nyayo slogan, or following in the footsteps of Jomo Kenyatta. This is quite interesting, such that if an elite opposed Moi, they were opposing Nyayo itself, and they would be seen as fighting against the father of the nation. And in a sense, this was political suicide. So this was a brilliant tactical move by Moi to keep elite loyalty at the beginning. But, as we'll see in the next slide, these advantages waned over time, and they were displaced by some disadvantages. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So on the whole, I still think Moi's inheritance is very weak relative to some of his contemporaries. First of all, as you all know, he comes from a relatively small, politically isolated community. He was only one of 2 Kalenjin ministers in Kenyatta's presidency, and it didn't give him much of a strong political base to work with from the beginning. Secondly, he was forced to retain this old guard, including the Change the Constitution cadres who opposed him. And he was forced to, and this was not just a political challenge, but a social challenge. By this, I mean, for example, I spoke with one of Moi's close associates, Erastus Moretti, who was actually Moi's prayer partner and later became a minister, who claimed that Moi was consistently demeaned by other KANU elites who viewed him as, quote, not worthy of the presidency back when he was vice president, specifically because of his lesser education. As you all know, Moi never received a university degree. And when he was vice president, his Kikuyu colleagues would use every opportunity to frustrate, undermine, and humiliate him, basically denigrating Moi for having lesser education than them and using their native tongue to try to exclude him. So what I mean is it was not just a political isolation, but a social one. So in addition to this old guard, who were pretty clearly adversaries of President Moi, he also did have allies. And two key figures here, as I'm sure you'll be able to recognize, is Charles Njonjo and Moi Kibaki, who were supportive of President Moi taking power. But I think we can describe these, as the British diplomats did so in a cable in, I believe, 1983, as being part of a bandwagon movement, where they're motivated more by strategic gain than deep-rooted personal loyalties. The new president was viewed by these figures as a passing cloud who could be manipulated by KANU elites to serve their own ends. British diplomats reported in 1981, I believe, that there was, quote, a growing unease among Kenyans that Moi, for all his shrewdness, does not have a grip on the government machine. And notably, this is in this honeymoon period that I was talking about that predates the 1982 coup attempt, where a lot of people think Moi changed his psyche. But even from the beginning, he was facing adversaries. To step back again, there's a famous quote from American writer Joseph Heller, where he says, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. And indeed, British diplomatic cables from the time revealed that even as early as 1981, Charles Njonjo, Paul Ngai, Munir Wayaki, and others were privately telling the British High Commissioner that they had become, quote, very concerned about the president's failure to take action, to take steps about certain situations, or consult his cabinet. So you're seeing this discontent that's emerging early on in his rule, even among many of the people who were ostensibly his political allies. So in short, Moi inherits a relatively weak position, and this in turn influences the way that he governs and the way that he treats his elites while in power. Next slide, please. Okay. So in this context, as I said, Moi inherits a weak position where he lacks robust social ties with the existing elite cadres. So in the absence of these strong social ties, he has to resort to a plan B, or sort of a less than ideal alternative. And that is two parts. First is to systematically stack key positions with trusted allies who he did share social ties with, who are not currently in government. And secondly, for the rest who he did not share social ties, create a system of rewards and punishments, which I'll call micromanaging and coup-proofing, based on material incentives. So I'll take these two in turn. First, with the stacking, predictably, as the theory suggests, Moi relied on both thick ties and thin ties to populate his regime. First, in terms of direct personal relations, he makes a concerted effort from the very beginning to try to elevate people that he had prior social relationships with. A couple of examples that stand out, and I'll address at length later in the talk, are his former neighbor and brother-in-law, Moses Mudavadi, who knew Moi from early in his political career, and his former student, Nicholas Biwott, who was literally a student of President Moi. So he elevates these people he's familiar with and trusts more and gives them more responsibility. In addition to thick ties, these direct relations, he also selects based on these thinner ties or these common backgrounds. And that's that he also surrounds himself with Kalenjin power brokers, such as Jonathan Ngeno, Kipengeno Arapingeni, and State House is dominated by officials who came from the various sub-tribes of the Kalenjin community. In addition to this, though, in coming back to education, I think is quite interesting. It's not that Moi did not value education. In fact, he often had very highly pedigreed advisors around him. But he did appear to have a clear skepticism of academic credentials as being sufficient to survive in Kenyan politics. Rather, he valued the types of advisors who had strong regional roots and understanding of local political dynamics. We might call this a sort of street smarts as opposed to bookishness. And in fact, I had the opportunity to talk to Professor Sam Ongeri, a Kisii politician who then became a minister, who told me that Moi would often dismiss his better educated advisors by saying, quote, "You professors do not understand politics." In addition, Moi's presidency was defined by surrounding himself in part by regional party brokers who eclipsed the power of even his ministers. And these individuals, interestingly, like Sheriff Nasir and Mulu Matisia and Kariuki Chotara, all almost tended to share the fact that they all only had a secondary level education, but were skilled political operatives. So Moi surrounds himself by these people who, again, are somewhat like him and have the same type of disposition on this criteria. Okay, the second part, for the rest, I'll quickly go through this because we're going to get the rest of it later. He doesn't share social ties with everybody, of course. And so for the rest of the people, he has to rely and fall back on these material ties. So he micromanages these people by interfering with their affairs, refusing to delegate authority to even ministers who are ostensibly, say, for example, in charge of finance or education, but withholds responsibility from them. He encourages division between many of his elites as a policy of staying in power. And some of these tools and strategies have sometimes been called in literature coup-proofing strategies, in which the goal is to divide and weaken your elites, to purge them, to shuffle them around, to ensure that they don't develop independent power bases. And so a lot of these are these material incentives that I've been talking about. If you don't have a strong social tie, you have to resort to patronage, fear, or these other sort of Machiavellian tactics to stay in power. And he made liberal use of this with many of his administrators. Okay, let's go to the next slide. In short, though, how successful was Moi in achieving elite cohesion under using this dual strategy? The problem with both of these, both stacking and micromanaging and coup-proofing, was that they helped Moi stay afloat. I mean, there's certainly, it's no coincidence that he was able to stay in power for 24 years because he was a professor of politics, as many have called him, very adept at using these techniques. But it was still a poor substitute for a strong and durable ruling coalition. And that's why when multi-party politics come around in 1992, we see mass defections of a lot of KANU cadres. So in short, Moi was relatively successful in staying in power, but not in achieving intrinsic loyalty amongst his ministers. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What's interesting, though, if we look to the individual level, there's some deviations from this. As I said, not everybody is treated similarly. Some have a more privileged experience under Moi. And so if we move from the system level down to this individual level, we get to break things down a little bit more and come to some interesting conclusions. So first, I'll talk about some general identity categories and present some data, and then I'll go through some individual illustrations. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is dangerous for me to introduce a lot of data here late in the talk, but I'll briefly go through it. This is from the 120 ministers that I tracked, and what I did is I tracked both a number of identity attributes and then whether they defected or not in the multi-party period. Here we see that generalizations are risky at best because we see a segmentation based on certain types of identity categories. I'm sorry, you probably can't see this text very well, but the one that's the highest here, this 2 category, is the number of Kikuyu, Meru, and Embu ministers who worked under President Moi. And we see in the red those who don't defect, and in the blue those who do defect. And we see almost 50% of Kikuyu ministers defected under Moi's presidency. Similarly, with the Luo, which is down here, has fewer number of ministers, but we see more than 50% of Luo ministers who served under Moi ended up defecting to an opposition party. And this is in contrast with the Kalenjin, Moi's home group, where we see the vast majority stay loyal to KANU throughout the entire period. Next slide, please. Put another way, we find that 42% of non-co-ethnics defected, while only 22% of co-ethnics defected. Now, this is a very small sample size, I'll admit, of course, and there's a lot of things going on here that I think we can go into in the Q&A. But it's still dramatic that there's almost a 2-to-1 difference in the probability of defection based on this criteria. Next slide, please. And it's not just tribe or ethnicity here. There's also by home region. If we segment by home region, we get similar results, where 38% of ministers who came from outside of Rift Valley province, Moi's home region, ended up defecting. But only 26% of ministers from his province defected. The next slide. And then finally, on this education part, this is quite interesting too, that we see similar results, where 43% of ministers with a bachelor's degree or higher ended up defecting, while 25% of ministers without a BA, like Moi, ended up defecting. The alternative explanation here, I think, is that more education gives you more opportunities to defect. So I think I can't quite rule that out. But I do find it interesting that this is consistent with the other results in the study and may suggest that there's something to this idea that Moi treated those who were lesser educated better. On to the next one, please. Okay, so the qualitative findings, this is where I'll get into a lot of the interviews. First, coming back to the mechanism 1, which I described as interpersonal trust and mutual obligation. Let me give you a couple of illustrations from some of the interviews that I was able to do. For instance, I was able to speak to Daumas Otieno, who was a Luo minister from South Nyanza, who interestingly remained loyal to KANU despite losing the 1992 and 1997 elections, being dropped as a minister, demoted in 1996, and losing control of his local KANU branch in May 2002. All of these types of demotions and withdrawal of privileges should suggest a potential for defection. But what's interesting, and he's located in a district that is heavily favored toward the opposition in Jaramogi Odinga, and then later Raila and the NDP. So why did he stay a KANU loyalist? Well, the interview I had with him revealed an interesting wrinkle, and that's that the answer seems to lie with his personal relationship with President Moi. Otieno told me that he grew close to Moi through his cousin Hezekiah Oyugi, who many of you are familiar with. And he said that him, Oyugi, and Moi would meet every weekend in Nakuru to discuss business when Otieno would work back in insurance, when he worked in insurance before entering politics. And at one point, Moi believed that he needed to bring the Luo community closer to KANU, and he designated Oyugi to become permanent secretary in Nairobi, but thought Otieno should run for office in South Nyanza. Predictably, after winning the 1988 elections, Otieno was immediately made a minister in Moi's cabinet. Ultimately, Otieno told me that he stayed in KANU because, quote, I was already there and was not the type of person to abandon the commitments I had made, speaking seemingly to the personal obligation that he had to the president. So this is a quite interesting example of someone you would have expected to defect, but because of these personal ties did not do so, which suggests that these social ties may help explain it. As another example, as I mentioned, I spoke with Professor Sam Ongeri from Kisii, who recalled his personal relationship with Moi when he was vice president, having become acquainted with Moi after Moi's personal driver was in a car accident and was treated by Sam Ongeri at Kenyatta National Hospital. After that, he said Moi and him became, quote, very close friends, and that they had a personal relationship, that he had a personal relationship with members of Moi's family, and even hosted Moi at his home. Ongeri later entered politics in 1988 and again was appointed minister. But in 1992, he was quite clearly rigged out of the KANU nomination because of Moi's need to accommodate Simeon Njai, who was one of Ongeri's local rivals. And Ongeri told me that he suggested that this was a humiliation to him and that he, quote, wanted to resign. But he was brought back from the brink by President Moi, who persuaded him to stay and help arrange for his next assignment. Ongeri noted that Moi, quote, didn't cheat people, and he upheld his promises. Later on, interestingly, ahead of the 2002 elections, Professor Ongeri stated that he preferred George Saitoti as Moi's successor, but bowed to Uhuru Kenyatta's candidacy, who was, of course, Moi's preferred candidate, explicitly because he was Moi's choice. He noted that the personal promise that he had given to Moi, that he had worked with the president for a long time and was, quote, not about to run away from the president. In other words, he felt a personal obligation to Moi. And he claimed that he stayed loyal in KANU because he was a person of principle and integrity. So these two illustrations sort of help to illustrate, and there's many others that we can go into, of people who maybe you'd be surprised that they didn't defect, but when you get deeper into their story, you start to realize that it's because of the trust and mutual obligation they had with the president. Secondly, briefly on, go back here. On information flows, I'll briefly talk about this. If you recall, what I was describing here is that personal relations and shared identities shape information processing, and strong closed networks tend to restrict the intake of objective, accurate information. Indeed, we see evidence from this period that politicians in both KANU and the opposition regularly overestimated the degree of their popular and elite support, in part, I think, because of the structure of the elite ties in the system. During the '92 elections, for example, all the major parties exuded confidence, at least initially, that they would win both the presidency and earn many seats in parliament. The problem with this, of course, was that assessments of their electoral prospects were filtered through close associates, who were often very similar in identity, background, and disposition. So as an example, Jaramogi Odinga in 1992, him and his colleagues almost certainly overestimated their appeal outside of outside of Nyanza and Luo land. And similarly, when I talked to both two Kisii MPs, including Ongeri and Chris Obure, they told me that Simeon Nyachai in 2002, who created an opposition party, Forward People, him and his allies consistently believed that he was generally going to win the election. They even bragged of doing things like moving State House to Kisii. Obure suggested to me, though, that he received significant pressures from his fellow politicians to side with Nyachai. But of course, in reality, in the end, Kisii was not representative of the rest of the country, and Forward People performed rather poorly in the polls. And I think, again, we see how shared identities in these closed networks can unduly influence perceptions of who will win and what their material prospects will be. So leading elites to make what appear in retrospect to be political mistakes. All right, great. So a little bit of time left. So finally and thirdly, on the third mechanism here, delegation of authority. This is what I find most fascinating about the entire project, is the degree to which how people perceived Moi depends on who you ask. Even the label dictator, which I have used as sort of an objective category, is very subjective depending on who you ask. Some of the loyalists were very reticent to use a term that even sniffed of authoritarian, while many of the defectors were liberally used it. And this is in part because I think that loyalists and defectors were treated differently. So for example, the politicians who became defectors almost invariably described Moi as along the lines I described, an autocratic micromanager who was insecure and ruthless in his use of various coup-proofing tools and techniques to weaken and divide KANU. Titus Mbathi, the Kamba minister I mentioned before, told me, for example, that he cited Moi's interference in his department, the Ministry of Labor, as a key turning point in his relationship with President Moi, and claims that this was the key reason why he ended up defecting from the party in 1992. Baruti Nabwera, who I've not spoken with, but has an interesting memoir, also says, quote, "We learned not to do or say anything on our own. If you made a decision without consulting Moi, he could easily overrule you. Moi's ministers were not allowed a free hand in their duties. Unlike Kenyatta, who left his ministers to make decisions concerning their respective ministries, Moi micromanaged his cabinet. And interestingly, like the others, Nabwera ends up defecting in 1994. What these examples share in common is that all of these ministers did not necessarily have long-standing personal links with President Moi. They also had relatively few shared common characteristics. And thus, predictably, they ended up defecting from KANU when given the opportunity. On the other hand, if you only talk to the loyalists who did not defect, you would never know that Moi was a dictator. In this depiction, Moi was trusting and caring, and he honored his commitments. He valued giving autonomy to his ministers. He hired based on expertise and qualifications, and remained committed to a concrete process of policy formulation. The difference between these two perspectives is really stark, and it could be due to selective memory or cognitive dissonance, but I think it's in part because these loyalists were generally treated differently by President Moi. I know I'm running a little over time here, but just let me give you a couple examples. For example, Ungary told me that Moi's trust is what unlocked many opportunities. Quote, if he trusted you, he would allow you to do certain things, like propose and oversee new projects. Dr. Sally Kozgay also emphasized that many ministers were selected based purely on merit, which is something that the defectors did not say. They actually thought that loyalty was privileged over merit. But interesting, Kozgay, who was a loyalist, noted that Moi tried to get, quote, top-rate candidates for cabinet positions. So again, we see here, if you're a loyalist, you have a different perception of how administration is being done. And I'll conclude here by going to two archetypical examples. Next slide here. Chances are, if I polled the room right now and asked you who were the two most influential ministers in Moi's regime, there's a pretty good chance we would settle on these two, Moses Mudavadi and Nicholas Biwott. And I think both are really interesting because they illustrate all three mechanisms that I was discussing before. For example, Moses Mudavadi, although being a Luya from Western Province, was posted as a young civil servant and education officer to Moi's home area in the early 1950s. Their families lived together and literally a doorstep away. Their wives were good friends. Their children attended the same primary school. And when the colonial government was seeking to expand the legislative council to the area, Mudavadi was critical in launching Moi's political career. He was the one who recommended, in fact, that Moi should become the local representative. So, and then later on, when Moi came to power, he returned the favor by honoring his close relationship with Mudavadi and naming him minister in 1979 and elevating him such that it became so powerful that he was the only KANU leader besides Moi himself who was able to receive goodwill delegations at his own home. I think this is a pretty striking example that this is not type of privilege or delegation that you would give to somebody that you did not absolutely trust. And yet, interestingly, he gave it to the one who he did have a long-standing relationship in Moses Mudavadi. And this historical relationship also gave Mudavadi the ability to speak straightforwardly and honestly with President Moi, which was a contrast to the prevailing environment. And even after Mudavadi died in 1989, unfortunately, this doesn't allow us to observe how he would have behaved if he had gone into the 92 elections. But insights from Mudavadi's son, Musalia, who is now, of course, Prime Cabinet Secretary of Kenya, offer some suggestions. Here, Moi quickly endorsed Musalia to run for his father's seat. He promoted him to the finance ministry. And interestingly, when Musalia would later flirt with defecting to NARC in 2002, he ultimately decided to stay in KANU. And he describes this in his memoir as the reason being because, quote, the ultimate driver for my retreat was the family ties and the traditional unity between my late father and President Moi. I must admit that Mzee Moi was very much like a father to me. In a way, he could not stomach, quote, having to rebel against a father, even though his material prospects may have been better served by defecting. So I think this is a striking example. And then finally, a lot of you all go to the final slide here. The next slide, this one's good. I'm not going to go too much into Nicholas Biwott because a lot of you know his story, but he was a student of Moi's, of course, in the 1950s. And then interestingly, Moi was instrumental in elevating Nicholas Biwott at every stage of his political career. During the colonial period, they worked closely together when Biwott was an information officer in Eldoret. Moi then helped Biwott secure a scholarship to study in Australia and was instrumental in his subsequent appointment as a district officer. Biwott resigned to enter politics in 1974, but lost in a landslide, which posed a problem at the time because civil servants were barred at the time from returning to their old positions if they left to contest elections. But President Moi intervened himself with President Kenyatta at the time, or sorry, Vice President Moi at the time, intervened with President Jomo Kenyatta to have Biwott reinstated. And later, when Moi persuaded the sitting MP in Biwott's district to step down, allowing Biwott to secure a seat in the National Assembly and soon thereafter the cabinet. In turn, Moi gave Biwott considerable sway over appointing government personnel, directing cabinet affairs, and even managing Moi's private financial affairs. Moi's former student exploited this opportunity to its fullest, developing a robust network of allies and informants in the political and security apparatus, and operated as what Honorable Caputo Arab Kiwa described as a silent operative who was careful to never leave a trail of evidence leading him back to Moi, which made him the ideal candidate for some of the president's more sensitive tasks. And again, we see that Biwot's deeply personal relationship with Moi meant that he remained loyal to the end. Dr. Kosgei, for example, told me that Biwot disagreed with Moi's decision to promote Uhuru Kenyatta in 2002 and claimed that it would cost him a seat in parliament. But he told Kosgei that he could not abandon Moi, his longstanding ally, and it was, quote, not his place to decide who to nominate. In the end, Biwot successfully defended his own seat, but KANU's defeat relegated him to opposition. So just to conclude, these two examples, I think, are nice illustrations of people who share social ties and longstanding ties and shared attributes with the president, who were then subsequently treated better, delegated more power and authority, and remained loyal to the president in the end. So finally, in conclusion, and I think I'm going to use this as a launching point, hopefully, for the Q&A, that there's so much more to explore in this topic, I think. And a few things I'll highlight here is one, is if you're going back to this graphic here, I spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between the dictator and the elites, but I haven't talked as much as I should about the relationships between other elites, between these yellow circles, if you will, where elites are taking cues from one another, others that are in the system. And they may also, and this came up in my interviews, getting cues from opposition leaders from outside the system, which then in turn influence their relations. So if it comes up in the Q&A, I'd love to expand upon this. Secondly, I basically, due to time, focus on political elites, but there's much more to be said about military and security elites as well. And then finally, if you're interested, I'm happy to share some of the insights from other countries or other contexts that help provide a nice contrast with the period that I'm looking at. So I've done a significant amount of research and other interviews and archival work in Uganda and Tanzania as well as under the Jomo Kenyatta period here in Kenya. It's probably too much, surely, for a dissertation, but it has made for a quite interesting project. So thank you for your time. Sorry, I went a little over time. I was pretty much right at an hour or so, but I'm looking forward to the feedback and questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that exhaustive treatise that you have given us. And I'm sure there are going to be several questions, comments, and even clarifications. I think when I was on this floor, I didn't introduce myself as the moderator, Adam Solo from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. And I'll go first, then you'll respond to me, then we open up, because I have more minutes in terms of raising some issues. And I want to start exactly where you have left, because you gave us the macro political picture of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, of the founding fathers. And I was just trying to inquire that, is it uniform? Because that impression came out, but if one was to unpack the three founding fathers, then you'll find that in Tanzania, in as much as Nyerere was a soft dictator, he opened up the party. It was a one party, but a one party that gave room for some form of participation, so that even as he ousted people like Oscar Kambona, he allowed the institutionalization of the party, so that he created an image of the party being bigger than him. And that party has lasted more than 3 decades after he left office and still determines who becomes the president. When you go to Uganda, then you find that what Obote was dealing with was very different from what Kenyatta and Nyerere were dealing with, because the Baganda had their own party, the Kabaka Yeka. They had been favored by the British colonialists, and they looked at themselves as a special breed. And therefore, the negotiation towards independence was that there would be a federal system in which the Kabaka would be the head of state, and Obote would be the head of government. And that was the kind of thing that Obote was not comfortable with. And therefore, when he finally decides that it's not workable, he invades the Kabaka's palace and basically tries to militarize politics. That comes biting him. And in Kenya, of course, I would have loved to hear you saying, what template did Kenyatta leave Moi? Because Kenyatta was not a party man. He never formed any party in his life. He came from jail. He found the party already there. And once in power, he put the party aside and used the provincial administration and state machinery to run the government. Moi tries to revive the party. So what do we learn from there? The second thing that I wanted to raise with you, while I agree that you have adopted the elite theory, quite a number of scholars, since you decided to go political science, way of which you are, and political scientists, or those who adopt political science mechanisms like Jackson and Rosberg, have chosen to use personal rule versus institutional rule. Where is the conceptual, where do you place personal rule in your elite theory? Because it's quite prominent out there in the literature. Coming forward, I know that you had a short time to talk about your full research, but I would have been interested in you talking of the dictator and the loyalists. What's the comparison, similarities and differences in Moi, the one-party dictator, and his loyalists, and Moi under the multi-party system and his loyalists? What changes? For example, what I have in mind is that in that divide and rule that you are talking about, under the one-party system, including Kenyatta, it was dividing the tribe. The tribe that you found very, very a threat to you, that's the one you divided. So you find that for Kenyatta, the Luo were the real threat. Yet the Luo started as his main allies. Achieng' Oneko as his personal secretary, they go to Boya as his secretary general, Odinga. And finally, what did he do? Divide the two. One goes forever. Moi, when he takes over power, it's not the Luo that are a threat, it's the Kikuyu that are a threat. And that's what you have demonstrated. He takes again two kingpins, Njonjo and Kibaki, and plays traitor and Njonjo out, demotion, Kibaki out. Demotion, sorry, Kibaki out. And then he takes a Kikuyu that doesn't have grassroots support. But when multipartyism comes, it's not just the tribe you're fighting. It's the movement you're driving. So now you don't have just to divide the tribe, you have to divide the party. And therefore, when Ford comes as a force, you have to divide it into two. How does that play in your all whatever? And remember, when Kibaki, I can say for lack of foresight, when he saw the Orange movement coming, he didn't divide it. He only finally divided it after it consumed him in the referendum. And now he divided it into ODM Kenya and ODM so that he had a weak. So how does that come in your analysis in terms of under one party and under multipartyism? Again, here, I don't want to be so absolute, but I might say that you might want to treat your informants cautiously. I'll pick two. Dr. Sally Kosgei, whom you have quoted, and I think her memoirs are coming out soon. I'm looking forward to them. But in one instant, you quoted as saying that for Moi, it was not necessarily the tribe. And I would ask, where is the evidence? Because when you finally look at who were his loyalists. You go and look at the security apparatus. In 3 years, he has removed all the Kikuyu in key security positions, whether in the army, whether in CID, whether in intelligence, and packed them with his tribe. And of course, Kibaki does the opposite. When he comes, he removes all the Kalenjins and brings the Kikuyu. And then the other one I would ask, which you talked of last, where she says that for Moi, it was ministers were appointed on merit. And again, I would ask that go and look at those who are available and those who are appointed, because then you are appointing cabinet ministers from MPs. And therefore, you can go and look at in terms of the MPs who are available to him and those whom he appointed, would it be merit or something else? And I think it's something else. It's not merit might place, but I think it's something else. It's more of trust and ability to use it. Then Dalmas, very interesting. You might want to look that Dalmas is a pragmatic politician. And I think for Dalmas, what he didn't tell you was that crossing over to Jaramogi or Raila would not have materially benefited him. He, like other loyalists, were like even Kamotho, very sure that I'm going to lose, but I'm going to be made a minister. So it's not, and you have to look at it from the fact that when finally Moi was going, he's very good at it. He crosses over to Raila, and he's the only non-Odingaist who gets appointed or nominated to be a cabinet minister, and immediately realizes that Raila will never be allowed to get, again, he crosses. And I remember once in parliament, he said, when you are talking of loyalty, I've been an insider, I've been an outsider, I've been an insider, and I can tell you. Right? And remember when he was sacked, the one that you're mentioning, he went public and said, I have no issue with Moi for sacking because I failed the loyalty test, because he had questioned one of the actions of Moi. So be very careful with what he tells you, because he's a very pragmatic politician in terms of which side of my bread is buttered. I think I've taken, I still have more, but maybe just lastly, in this study, how do you balance in terms of hierarchy between the dictator trusting you, the person serving him, versus me, the person serving him, being loyal? How do you juggle the ball? The trust that he or she has on you and the loyalty that you profess, if it's not psychophancy, the loyalty that you profess. I think I still have some, but I think for now, you can answer those, then I'll open it up.
This is awesome. That was a terrific set of comments. Thank you. I'm really excited. I think this offers the launching point I was looking forward to, sort of broadening the discussion to many of the weaknesses in my study, but also to some things we can generalize from. First of all, on the first point about macro conditions, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, I want to clarify that I don't think they're uniform, and that's what's interesting about them. So on basic conditions, right, they all gain independence at the same time. They all become de jure, at least one party, de facto one-party states. But beyond that, there's significant differences. And those differences come from the networking, the building of social ties, and the building of networks that happens in the pre-independence period. And I think this helps explain the differences we get. So for example, Julius Nyerere had the benefit not only of being an extremely charismatic and generally likable figure, but he had, from 1954, when KANU was developed, to 1961, when he gained independence, 7 full years of being in Tanzania, not being arrested, being pulled, being able to build a strong network across the entire country, and tapped into an educational network. He was a teacher, of course, and used a lot of that to travel around the country to other schools to make allies, and partially to make allies. And he generated these strong personal ties. And so when he becomes president, or prime minister and then president in 1961, he has the benefit of a strong inheritance of a, according to my logic, a strong set of intrinsic loyal ties. So he has some exceptions like Kambona, but for the most part, really strong. The opposite side, Milton Obote. Interestingly, he spends his formative period not in Uganda, but in Kenya, right? Because he leaves Makerere after just 1.5 years or 2 years, isn't able to finish there, goes very quickly to work closely with the Kenyan independence movement. And the problem with that is he wasn't able to build as strong alliances back in Uganda. And so when he does come back, he's late to the game. And even sort of hagiographical accounts of Milton Obote that I've read have admitted, even the like pro-Obote accounts admit that he had very few allies when he came to power. And so, of course, this then influences the way that he behaves. And he resorts very quickly to a lot of this divide and rule tactics, which ultimately are not successful in sustaining his rule. So I just want to reinforce the point here that like all of these leaders are inheriting different systems, in part a mix of structure and agency. Like they built it for themselves, but restricted by some structural factors. And so we get these different results. So I think it's interesting, we can go into that more, but I think it's interesting to look into the colonial period and how these alliances were built. Secondly, on the personal versus institutional rule, I left the discussion of institutions intentionally out of this for brevity's sake, but I'll bring it back in here briefly. There's a very popular argument in political science right now that argues that the creation of formal institutions like political parties, legislatures, elections that are pseudo-democratic, that appear to be democratic, but are maintained under an authoritarian setting, have the effect of co-opting elites, pulling them into the system, and sustaining loyalty. I don't think we should dismiss these out of hand, but I'm worried that these accounts are missing the antecedent step, which is something that there's about historical relations and this network building that both explains the creation of the institution itself and the ultimate outcome of cohesion. So me basically saying there's an institutional setup of a strong party doesn't tell me enough to convince me that this is the basis for cohesion and loyalty, because that itself is a product of a process that comes before. So I don't dismiss it out of hand, but I think that we should focus more on, I wouldn't call it personal rule per se, and I don't disagree with Jackson and Rosberg's typology. I think it's quite interesting, but it is certainly personal networks. There is a social system of ties that predates those institutions. Third, on the comparative differences between Moi under one party and then after 92 and multi-party, it's a really good question. On one hand, I think his strategy remains similar in one key regard. Let's take the divide and rule strategy. A very similar strategy that he used to divide Charles Njonjo and Moi Kibaki, he then used again against different, Kibaki and other adversaries in the multi-party period. So he had a huge advantage that Njonjo and Kibaki were rivals. And so he exploited this. And there could be an argument that if Njonjo and Kibaki were on the same page, that they could have posed a serious challenge to Moi. But because he was able to divide them by playing them off each other, by promoting each other's adversaries, by demoting them, that he was able to survive. And because of the weakness of the ties between those two. So come multi-party, Moi does a similar thing with the opposition. He says, okay, Jaramogi Odinga has his party, Moi Kibaki has his party, and then later Kenneth Matiba emerges with Forda Sili, and he says, I can use this to my advantage. I'm going to try to exploit the divisions between these three key figures and others to try to stay in power. And interestingly, in my interviews, it even came up where it was just surprising to me that a number of people who worked under Moi admitted to the sort of nefarious techniques that they used to divide the opposition. For example, inventing new opposition parties, which I think we all suspected was happening, but I got some confirmation in my interviews that this probably was happening, creating additional opposition parties to further divide the elite. Interestingly, there was also a concerted effort to elevate Kenneth Matiba. There was some evidence that suggested that when he was coming back from the UK and returning to Kenya after receiving medical treatment, that a number of the people that were in the crowd were hired by KANU and placed there to try to make Matiba appear more popular than he was. And he was a popular figure, but KANU wanted to exploit that to kind of get into Kenneth Matiba's psyche to make him think that he was the most popular leader in Kenya. And therefore, he stayed in the race, he divided Ford, and the rest is history. So that divide and rule technique is happening throughout. It's quite interesting. But of course, the multi-party system does introduce new constraints, and there's new adaptations. And that's where I think it's important to note that the strategy does not remain uniform, but can change over time. And Moi was very adept at this. On the interviews with Dr. Kosgei and Otieno, I think this is a good opportunity to reinforce that we should take these interviews with a big grain of salt, in part for the reason that I explained, which is there's almost a positionality to it of, we think of positionality as introducing bias. And I think that's true here, of if you were a loyalist of Moi, you're going to say nicer things about President Moi. And indeed, that was happening in my interviews significantly, and it was hard to cut through that. So when we say things like Dr. Kosgei says that appointments are based on merit, I don't believe that necessarily. Another contingent will tell you they weren't, that they were based on loyalty. And you're right, State House and the security apparatus was to a significant degree filled with people who shared Moi's background. So I think we got to take this with a big grain of salt, but it's interesting itself that even the narrative they're giving is reflected or is a product in part of the way they were treated under President Moi. So it's cool. And in the final point, I didn't quite understand if we were talking about the hierarchy of dictators trusting versus being loyal. So maybe we can follow up after, and we can discuss that more. Thanks.
Okay, we are now. And we will start with those who are present physically before we go to those who are online. So by a show of hand, we will bring a mic to you. You just say your name, your institution, and you shoot the question. Just pass the mic.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse my voice, I'm getting over a cold. So thank you, Andrew. This has been a fascinating presentation. I am speaking from a position of somebody who is neither a political scientist nor historian, nor specifically an expert in East Africa. But I am intrigued by, even the sort of nominal comparison that you're drawing to sort of frame your analysis between, what happened in Uganda under Obote, what happens in Kenya under Moi, and then of course what happens in Tanzania under Nyerere. And specifically, what I'm interested to understand is it correct to speak of these all as dictatorships? Because it seems to me the conditions of legitimacy in each of these three regimes really vary significantly. I mean, I find it hard to think of Nyerere really as a kind of a dictator, because he had a lot of real popular support, and he retained that throughout his leadership. So I just, what is the definition of dictatorship that we're working with here? Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Anais Angelo. I'm an historian based at the University of Vienna and an affiliate of the history department here at the University of Nairobi. I have one comment and a question. The comment is that maybe you could also take the archives with a grain of salt, because I don't think that when you mentioned Njonjo and other writing to the British diplomats, I don't think they ever gave any information about politics without a clear interest in mind to the British. So they were just not informing, they were trading information. So it also nuanced a little bit this idea of are they really intending to defect or not? I think the British didn't understand very well, I think, the refined politics going on in Kenya from the 1960s onwards. And then my question was also about the place of institution and personal rule. This has been answered and discussed already. I like your approach to about working on the trajectory, but I think that there is also a discourse that these politicians built about what their trajectory is and what their shared social relationship is and so on. Especially, I mean, in the interviews, I don't know, but especially in autobiographies that have been published. And so my question is, what about what they do not say? And what about the relationship that they build and they do not talk about? And so I was wondering if you had come across the importance of leisure activity. So not social connection in the past, but social connection during their time in power, clubs, golfing, and business, which is also probably difficult to trace, but business relationships are complex, and in the autobiographies, they're not mentioned, but they're also probably very important when it comes to building trustful relationship in politics. So, but thank you in any case for your wonderful talk, and I learned a lot from it. So thank you very much.
Right. We have somebody at the back. We have two people. We'll just check the whole round from the physical, and then he'll answer, then we go to the group online.
Thank you, Andrew, for that very good presentation. I enjoyed it. I just have very simple questions. I'm a historian. I belong to the Department of History and Archaeology. And I'm just wondering, could we say dictators are born or made? Because I'm thinking about your presentation and I'm seeing a weak Moi coming to power and then being kind of forced to be a dictator for the sake of survival. And I'm also just wondering if this could be true, that dictators, as Moi's case demonstrates, depend on their allies, but they want their allies to feel that they depend on him. Thank you very much.
We have another hand at the back.
Thank you, Andrew, for such a wonderful presentation. I have a few questions. My first question is, like what has been asked first, is the definition of the term dictator, because you used autocracy and dictatorship, seeming it is the same. I think I tend to differ. Not all autocracies are dictators. So you need to look at that. But also, as you are coming up with the issues of royalists and defectors, I think ethnicity, colonial legacies, ideological differences, culture can also play a part in that. And also, as you are defining your terms, you need to also look at the perspective. Is it a Eurocentric perspective or an Afrocentric? Because sometimes they are different. I'm a historian from this department. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's another hand there, then we'll finish with the chair here.
Thank you. I'm Marco Tiende, a student from the Department of History. I don't have a question, but I wanted to recommend the department for running such a discussion because it has added some value to what I'm doing in my research project on Allied constructed constitution during multi-party democracy. So I think I have captured a lot which will be very important to my study. Then Professor Adam Solo, you talked about you talked about elite during multi-party democracy, which I think Andrew can elaborate to me further. It will be very resourceful to understanding it. Then Andrew, if you can liaise me with the notes after this, I would really appreciate. Thank you very much.
And you are maximizing on this occasion, which is very, very good. Chair.
Maybe I stand. Thank you, Andrew. This is really very eye-opening, very great ideas coming out. As Aeneas talked, I thought of Muthaiga Golf Club and the Kibaki administration, but probably Moi was a good Christian teetotaler, more known for going to church as opposed to going to clubs. Maybe you will tell us more about that. I have a comment and a question. Let me begin with a comment. Now, as you grappled with what you are calling the thick and thin ties that were meant to enhance the prospects of royalty to the Moi state, I thought to myself that probably if you go beyond Moi, you find that his key supporters at the lower levels use the same method, actually, of friendships, of links, both filial and social. I thought of somebody like Simeon Sansoranyachai. You know, at some point, all the 11 MPs in Kisii were somehow related to him. You know, if you go down, you find that his father, Senior Chief Nyandusi, married from virtually every clan and sub-clan in Kisii as a way of, you know, galvanizing loyalty to his regime. So I could wish that you go beyond Moi and see how this tendency to build loyalty on these ties went beyond and were replicated in the grassroots. And this could qualify to be Moi's key and pillars in political royalty. Maybe that's something interesting. Now, my question is on Moi and the academy. This is really missing in your study. I never had you, unless probably I slept at some stage. I never had you talk about this, but Moi had, you know, a near special attachment to members of the academy. And for some reason, he had this obsession with having links with historians, particularly from this particular department where you're presenting today. Dr. Sally Kosgei was a member of this department. Dr. Benjamin Kipkorir was a member of this department. Professor Henry Mwansi at some stage was a member of this department. Professor Ida Salim was a member of this department. Dr. Yusuf Nzubo was a member of this department. Professor William Ochieng, you know, I can go on and on, including his one-time vice president, Dr. Josephat Njuguna Karanja, who was a member of this department. You know, if I was living in Moi's time as the chair of the department, I will feel like I'm nearly getting something in the political establishment, because Professor Ida Salim left from being chair of the department, and then he was sent as Kenya's ambassador to Netherlands, and then he rose. Dr. Sally Kosgei was taken from here, made Kenya's ambassador in London, and ended up being, you know, I could be feeling much comfortable. So my question is, one, of course, what was it with historians that attracted Moi, including pulling Ochieng from the academy and making him his private secretary in State House? What was it in historians, and more particularly from this department that I chair, that attracted him? Could it be that he actually made what he didn't have by association with academics, that then challenges your view that Moi treated those who were less educated better than those who were educated. He had a very special relationship with members of my department. And these were very highly educated men. Does your hypothesis still hold with those examples? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you can answer those, then we'll go online.
I got one. Working. Cool. Another set of fantastic questions. Thanks for this. So I knew this was going to come up. What's the definition of dictatorship or authoritarian regimes? First of all, I'll start. I do use dictatorship, authoritarian regime, autocracy is the same. Some people might dispute that, but I think for the most part, they can be treated the same. This is a fascinating discussion, I think, and here's why. On one hand, I could take a dogmatic approach and tell you that there's an objective definition of autocracy. I think your typical American political scientist would probably fall back on that, which would say that there's a minimal definition that it takes to be a democracy, which is that there's free and fair elections, there's political competition, and there's at least a general heightened state of civil liberties and press freedoms and civic freedoms. If you're not achieving that under this definition, you're in this residual category of an autocracy. Now, this is the strict definition, and I think this comes not necessarily from a historian's view, but it comes from like more the dogmatic types that often try to be very clear about terms. What do we call autocracies and democracies? So if we do this, I don't necessarily throw this out of hand, because I think despite even someone like Julius Nyerere, who comes off well in history and certainly had a lot of popular legitimacy, we can't get around the fact that political competition outside of the one-party state was heavily circumscribed and at one point outright banned. So by this definition, it's the one-party state makes it a dictatorship. And where I think my contribution is that it doesn't mean all dictatorships are the same. In fact, what's so interesting about Nyerere is he has a more relaxed sort of liberal view. I think he's a soft dictator, as someone described him. But that is in part a product of the network building that he did prior to coming to power and the comfort that he had in his position, which I think allowed someone like Nyerere, even though it was still vis-a-vis the opposition, a dictatorship and a one-party state, he still allowed for internal debate, internal democracy. There was competitive elections within the party, right? There was somewhat free press. There were some things that he was able to, because he was so confident, I think secure in his position, that he was able to afford those privileges. So that's how I can wrap around that he's still a dictator, but he, behaves differently from the others. Now, the subjective version is quite interesting. I think the interlocutors I spoke with here, and I think it's reflected here in the room a little bit, is more of a definition of dictator that is tied to the way, the management style or the leadership style of the leader himself. And this is exactly how the interviews that I did, I think, reflected this as well. When people would say Moi was a dictator, they meant he was a micromanager. He interfered in our affairs. He purged elites. He shuffled us around. He divided us. He encouraged weak elites around him. These are all the types of things that are tied to a leadership style that I tried to bring out. And what's subjective about it is that some people say that Moi was a dictator and these others don't mention it at all. So there's no way around this to say this. We have to be comfortable in that state of not having an objective definition and just saying, depending on your positionality or on your relationship, you're going to have a different term. So this is the best way I can square this and still say that if these are comparable units, but they do definitely have dramatically different perspectives. And I think they're related to what I was talking about of sort of your inherited position. So happy to talk about that more if more future questions come up, but I think that hopefully addresses a couple of the comments here. Annie's, thanks for the great comments about taking the archives with a grain of salt. I agree with you, though I'm still struck, interestingly, both in Uganda, Tanzania, and in Kenya, of the number of cases where a defection follows within weeks or months of them saying something to the British. So it's quite interesting that they do hold their word and that they're not just manipulating the British per se. I'm sure they're manipulating the British to some degree, but I'm struck by the number of cases where the archives gives like a head start or like a privileged information that predicts defection, which is quite interesting. But your point is well taken. Leisure activities. I'll say this, I definitely think, the Mutaiga Club is a good example. And a lot of my interviews reflected this, that there was always like kind of dedicated gossip time, which oftentimes happened after meetings or in the lead or right before meetings. So the meetings themselves would sometimes be formalized, but then before and after there was time to chit chat. And this is where a lot of the intrigues happened, and they happened at night at these social clubs and things. So this definitely is happening. But I'll use this as an opportunity to reinforce a point, which is that I don't think that the relationships that are forged once you're already in politics and that both sides are already in politics are as powerful as the relationships that were built before they come to politics. So the reason I say that is because once you're in politics, there's a risk that the reason you're developing a good relationship with someone else is purely for political gain. Is an attempt to try to curry favor in this new political environment. In a way, we can think of this as sort of staged or faked or not pure in a way. I mean, I'm sure certainly these friendships did develop, but whereas if you have friendships and alliances that are formed before both sides of the party come into politics, there's more of an assurance that your relationship is built on something more than just seeking an advantage by currying favor with someone. And so I think I don't focus as much on the relationships that are built once ministers are already ministers, for example, and are already deeply embedded in politics. But I focus on the relationships that are developed before they come into politics. So hopefully that's helps answer your question, but also reinforces a point. Dictators, are they born or made? That's a great, I love that terminology. I think it's a great way of putting it. And I'll say, and maybe it's dissatisfying, but it's a mix of both. So they're born in some degree in the sense that there are certain qualities like charismatic oratory that I think can't be replicated by everybody. You can't practice, you can practice how to captivate audiences and how to communicate with people, but there are some people that are specifically talented at that. And someone like Julius Nyerere stands out. This. And I think Jomo Kenyatta, to some degree, definitely captivated crowds in a way that other leaders were not able to do so. But the made part is quite interesting. I would say that if I had to say, Moi did make himself, I suppose, as a dictator because he was forced to. And this reinforces the point I was saying. The really strong leaders are those who inherit strong positions. But when they come to power, someone like Nyerere or I think Kenyatta fit this profile better, of people who already have assured loyal elites around them. They don't have to work as hard to maintain that loyalty. And hence, interestingly, I think you see less of this manipulation, of this divide and rule, of these purges and shuffling and this Machiavellian tendencies under leaders who inherit strong positions. But Moi had a weak position, so he had to make himself into a dictator by doing these tactics. So they think that's maybe it's not quite what your question was getting at, but I think it's an interesting, another interesting contrast between different types of leaders and the relationship between what they inherit and how that influences their strategy. There was another question about the definition of dictator and autocracy, which hopefully I covered. I'll note the point, yes, about the loyalty and defections, that there's certainly, and I think you mentioned ethnicity, culture, and many other potential factors that influence this. I certainly agree, and I would love to talk to you more further after the talk to clarify what you mean, but it reinforces a point that it's really hard to pin down what specific identity or what specific factor is the most important in shaping these personal relationships. And so that's a challenge to my study. It would be easier for me to say, like, this factor matters the most, but as good historians, social scientists, whatnot, I think we have to admit that there are multiple avenues, that there are multiple potential factors at play. And so the hard part is pinning down what that is. Let me see. On the the comment about the multi-party politics, and I appreciate that you noted that you that this talk added value to you. I'm happy to talk and share notes with you after the talk, and would love to meet you and to speak about this further. Let me see. So Professor Mbongi's notes about others replicating the same point down to everything. This is great. I had a whole section in my talk that I left out, which is that personal relations and shared backgrounds do not just govern relationships between the leader and the people working under them, but of course, all the relationships. There's a strategy, as you noted with Samin Nachai's example, to try of other elites in the system to try to surround themselves with people who are like them, who they can trust. A couple examples that stand out to me, for example, I mentioned my interview with Titus Mbathi. He explicitly basically told me that when he left Moi's administration and defected to Ford in 1992, he then had a choice of like which opposition party to stick with. Should I stick with Ford, Kenya? Should I go to Fortisili? Should I go to the DP? And he explicitly said, I went to Fortisili because Kenneth Matiba was my longtime friend and longtime ally. We were both permanent secretaries at the same time and developed a very strong relationship. And he ultimately, Mbathi was amongst the group that formed the KNC and broke away from Matiba. But the initial discussion was influenced heavily by this personal relationship. To use another example, Moody Awori's biography, Riding a Tiger, or something dramatic like that, I think. He has a really great line in there where he says, I would not have survived in this era if it was not for my relationship with Moses Mudavadi, who was my mentor and key ally. And it reinforces this point that that elites are always seeking out people who will protect them and who will keep them safe in this cutthroat environment. And so I agree that this is both a strategy and a necessity for elites working in the system beyond just the dictator himself. The final point about the academy, this is a tough and great question. Admittedly, I didn't look into this as much as I should have, Moi's relationship with the academy. And you're right that he did bring in a number of faculty straight from the University of Nairobi and elsewhere. You will know this far better than I do, and I'm curious what your thought is on this, but my initial thoughts are this. On one hand, we could interpret this as an attempt to bring in internal debate or to bring in someone who has an academic credential who could then question the policies. But I'm not sure how much evidence there is of that. I mean, I wonder what these conversations between President Moi and faculty here were like. Did faculty have to guard their opinions to try to satiate the president? Did they have to, or are they willing to speak their mind? If they're willing to speak their mind, I think that's counter to my argument for sure, and it's definitely a challenge. If the alternative explanation is that Moi brought in academics to try to bridle the economy or to weaken the economy or to bring in people to lessen debate or to bring in people who had academic credentials but still were willing to toe the party line, then that's a different story. So you'll know about this better than I do. So I'm curious what the reality was at the time. But this association with the academies isn't clear to me how this influences the hypothesis and the argument without further study and detail. So I'd love to follow up you with this.
How about the obsession with historians?
Yeah, yeah. Specifically historians, yeah.
I was wondering about the obsession with historians.
Right.
Of course, he worked with other guys like Philip Mbithi, who was a sociologist.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
Saitoti, a mathematician. Ongeri, a medic.
Yeah.
But he had this special relationship with historians.
Right, exactly. I don't have a good answer for that. But it depends on the content. I'm not sure. Is there something about history that makes Moi feel comfortable around those people? I don't know. It's a good question. So I can treat that as homework for myself to look more into.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. As we go to online, as you look at Moi and historians, look at those historians when they served Moi.
Yeah.
Did they remain true to their profession? Or did
exactly.
All right. Okay, we now go online to our participants online, and you can raise your hands, and you'll be given a chance to either make a comment. I can see Professor Susan Mwela. We'll start with you.
Have to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Thank you for your interesting talk. I think the focus on social ties is interesting, but I'm worried that in doing that or putting so much weight on it that you might be losing the forest for the trees. In the sense that, I mean, as somebody who lived under Moi, it was extremely repressive in every aspect, and it filtered down into the lives of ordinary people as well as elites. And I noticed in your talk that your data does show, if you look at the defectors versus those who stayed with Moi, there's a strong ethnic element. And I here at one with Professor Lowe, I think that was very important. So I think in trying to explain the dynamics of Moi's regime, I think you really need to look at one of the theories that you mentioned in the beginning, then sort of thought it had some defects, which is the carrot and the stick. I mean, for those who defected, if you were a Kalenjin and you defected, the costs were much higher than if you were a Kikuyu and you defected. And that's because both of the repression that possibly awaited you and because of the loss of patronage that you'd accrued. And so I think you might want to take a look at the economics of the regime and the repressive aspect of the regime. What happened to the extent that there were Kalenjin defectors, what happened to them in both in terms of repression and in terms of patronage, or loss of income, loss of jobs. And as you know, I mean, I've written about repression under the Kenyatta regime and concentrated heavily on the carrot and the stick. And I think that you might find that these social relations coincide heavily with other factors that might be more important than the ones you have discussed in explaining actual behavior. So anyway, I wondered if you had looked at the economics of the defectors and those who stayed. In other words, did they lose their jobs? Were their loans called in? Were they taken off statutory boards? What happened? Was that more influential than social ties in explaining who did or didn't stay? And was ethnicity. So those are the factors that I would, in other words, to either bolster or minimize what you've said about social ties, I think you need to take a look at those factors, the economics, the repression that awaited people who defected, and the economic loss that awaited them. So thank you very much. It was interesting. I thought you've done an interesting job here.
Thank you, Prof. I'm sure you have in mind people like Jean Maria Serone, people like Speaker Moses Keino, and the like. Amy Nichols.
Hello, I am a cultural anthropologist and a Fulbright Fellow in the University of Nairobi Institute for Anthropology, Gender and African Studies. And I found the talk very, very interesting. I'm not a expert on the Moi regime by any means. But I have a methodological question or a methodological comment perhaps, which is that, one of the concerns was about the kind of truth and veracity of these interviews, right? And as an anthropologist, right, a person whose kind of bread and butter is interviewing and collection of narrative, I wonder about the decision to name both ethically and also in terms of veracity, the fact that you're actually naming your informants rather than sort of referring to them with pseudonyms. I mean, yes, perhaps it might be obvious to individuals who were, very close ties with Moi, but I wonder if you run the risk of losing more subtle critiques of the regime, and perhaps even less subtle critiques of the regime by not guaranteeing some level of protection to your interlocutors. And then on the question of like, are archives valid? Of course, just, you know, all of these different forms of knowledge are products of a variety of sort of political and social factors. But that's where triangulation comes into play. But I do wonder about the sort of naming of individuals that are still living that were part of an oppressive political regime. Thank you.
Do we have any other? I don't see any hand yet. So as we wait for another hand, maybe Andrew, you can answer those two.
Great. These are also excellent questions and comments. Let me start with the second one first, but methodological question. Thank you for that perspective. And you hit on a point that I wrestled with my local ethics IRB committee at Berkeley significantly, whether to anonymize or whether to allow people to give their names. And I went through a rigorous process in which I ensured that data would be protected and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the approach we chose was a consent, or oral consent that suggested, are you willing to use your name attributed to this study or not? I expected a lot of people to go anonymous, but not a single person that I interviewed when I asked them that question was wanted to go anonymous. They almost invariably said something to the effect of, everything I speak is the truth, their truth at least. Or everything I speak is publicly known already. Like people are used to doing public interviews. A lot of these, even unsavory details of Moi's regime have come out in the Daily Nation, for example, that they've done these types of interviews before. And so I got the sense that they felt comfortable, both me attributing them directly and using their name. So that's the approach I took. Maybe there would have been more benefit if we had gone anonymous, but I don't think that it ever came to a point where it stifled discussion, the fact that I was using their name. So I think both ethically and practically, I feel somewhat confident that I made the right choice here, but happy to take further criticisms on that. But your point still, like the point about all sources of whether archives or interviews and the difficulty of verifying the veracity and the biases that are implied is a thorny problem that academics of all disciplines have been dealing with forever. And there is still no perfect answer, right? And so as you suggested, the strategy I took was triangulation. There's a risk of triangulation is like you spread yourself too thin. But I think in this case, maybe I should have said when I presented my method section, not a single one of these methods is perfect, but in aggregate, hopefully we can be assured that there's a reasonable response, that we're coming to some reasonable agreement. So this is a lesson for all of us, of course, that it's really difficult to rely on a single method. Professor Mueller's question, thank you for this. I'm familiar with your work and I love your work on carrots and sticks. And in a way, I've dealt with this type of question before. And I'll try through 3 responses sort of address it. First, I should have made this even more clear in my talk. I still think the predominant approach to many leaders or many elite leader relationships under the Moi period and elsewhere was still governed by these material ties, or carrots and sticks as you suggest them, for sure. But that's consistent with, I think, what I was describing as the majority of people who don't fall in this category of having a strong social tie with the president. So if you don't have a social tie with the president, then you are much more likely to respond to these material incentives instead, because the president is not assured of your trust. So he has to buy you off, or he has to keep you afraid using some sanction like withdrawing a loan at the bank, for example, to keep your loyalty. So I think this work that I've described as material incentives or patronage and fear or carrots and sticks can still complement the social dynamic by saying both are operative, but the missing element here that explains some of the deviations or people that you wouldn't expect if we took a material logic but still remain loyal, suggests to me that there's something else going on. Maybe not the predominant factor in all these relationships, but something that was missing, and hence why I brought this in. I also think this isn't directly your question, but I think it's an important point. What's interesting, and it goes back to my discussion of what constitutes a dictatorship, I think that leaders can behave differently vis-a-vis the external opposition or the people outside the party. So say in this case, Ford and the DP and other opposition parties that emerged behave differently than their strategy of how they treat internal elites. So as an example, under Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, as I said, Nyerere, I think, was much more willing to accommodate internal debate within the party, internal democracy. He was willing to delegate more responsibility to his ministers. But toward the external opposition, so he faced significant threats from trade unions, from chiefdoms, from a significant number of external actors at the beginning of his rule, he was rather ruthless. And he used these tools like carrots and sticks against them. So this is interesting. How do we reconcile this? I think the best way to reconcile it is that the strategy that leaders pursue with their internal ostensible allies can be different from the way they behave toward an outside group. And so we can reconcile this and say something like the way that Jomo Kenyatta treated the KPU was ruthless, of course, but the way that Jomo Kenyatta may have accommodated people inside KANU at the time may have been different. Similarly, we might say things about Moi, although I do think the two approaches converge a lot under Moi, where we see a relative similarity. And finally, about the loans being called in, I thought a lot about this, and this did come up a little bit in my interviews and other research. A couple examples, for example, that stand out is Njoroge Mungai and Paul Ngai, who both of which I think were subjected to this phenomenon, as you suggested, right around the multi-party period, where they initially thought about defecting or did defect, and then the Kenyan government effectively pressured banks to recall their loans. I don't know if there's perfect evidences. I'm basing this based on secondary sources, so don't quote me on this. But I think this was a factor, and in fact, in Njoroge Mungai's case, he comes back into KANU after defecting for approximately, I think, 1 or 2 months, right when multi-party period happens. And then after, I think, that this bank recall happens, he comes back in the coalition. But I'll reinforce this point by that again, if you're having to resort to those measures, you're admitting weakness, you're admitting some challenge with that relationship. And I think that if you have these more robust social ties, you won't have to resort to that type because you'll have mutual trust and you won't have a situation where the only way you can maintain the loyalty of the elite is by doing an extreme measure like this. So that's the way I reconcile it, but happy to discuss this further. Thanks.
Professor. Okay, we go to Peter Mwangi, then we'll go to Professor Mola, whom I'm again seeing a hand. Peter Mwangi.
Yes, excellent talk. Excellent seminar. So I only have one question. And this is the fact that, as you have alluded to in your discussion, most of Moi's allies said, especially I think you talked about Professor Mongeri, who said that there was contempt by many ministers in Kenyatta's inner circle towards Moi. And this is true, I think Professor Olo will say this all the time. I think John talks about a passing cloud. We used to hear things like that. If the lead ship is limping, the herd will not reach the pasture. The question that I would like to ask, when you talk about the initial weaknesses of Moi, these were the things that were making him weak. Did you get any sense from his close associates that he regarded himself an accidental president, or that his ascent to power was as a result of a closely crafted, a well-crafted plan? Did you get an impression from his advisors that they regarded his ascent to power also as accidental or not? And do you think that this sense, if it exists, of being an accidental rise to power, also may have contributed to him becoming the making of a dictator, as one of the previous questioners said. Thank you.
Is your hand up again?
No. I brought it down. Sorry.
Okay, I thought Professor Mwala's hand was up again, but I think
Okay, yes,
that's-
you're right. I was just going to ask Andrew, I mean, taking your example of Biwott, yes, this is somebody who had social ties with Moi, but nevertheless, whether because of that or because he was just a Kalenjin in the right place, he agglomerated a huge amount of power and a huge amount of wealth. Now, in the end, really, isn't that what mattered? And rather than his social ties. And obviously, it would have been, he remained a loyalist because he got both power and wealth from this president. And had he left, who knows what would have happened? I mean, one should remember that under Moi, people were killed. They disappeared. There was a sense of, an ominous sense of repression from the top to the bottom. So the costs of defection were not just simply material I mentioned having your loans brought in, but also the fear of repression. So again, I mean, what I'm using with this example of Biwott, and it might be similar with other examples, is that you have a high correlation between what do I call social ties, if you want to call them that, and the agglomeration of power and wealth, which could be used to repress and seduce. And Biwott was a much feared person. I can say that, having lived there under Moi. So I'm just wondering if these social ties can be separated out that neatly from these other factors. Thank you.
Yeah, let me take the second one. Thanks for the follow-up. I'll take that one first and then get to Professor Mwangi's question. So yeah, let's take the Biwott example. If President Moi is in a weak position, he's going to be extremely reticent to allow anyone to accumulate power and wealth, just as we described how Biwott, what he eventually ended up having, these extreme amount of power and wealth, as I discussed. So interestingly, and there were other people who accumulated power and wealth during this time. Simeon Nachai, Kenneth Matiba, they made a lot of money and they had a lot of allies and they had a lot of power. And yet they were disposed of in part because Moi, or they were demoted or whatnot, and because Moi distrusted them. So how did Biwott get away with this while the others did not? Accumulating wealth and power. I think, again, I have to reconcile it with this special connection, this social tie that existed, that Moi would not have afforded to someone else, but was willing to allow and delegate authority to Biwott solely because he trusted him because of this strong history. So he's a really interesting example of this, of wealth itself. So there is no direct correlation, I don't think, between power and wealth and probability of defection without constituting this alternative explanation or variable, if you will, of did they have a social tie with the president or not? And so that's the best way I can sort of reconcile this argument of still justifying that I think social ties are quite important. But your point about repression is still well taken. And of course, there is a high cost of defection, and it describes a lot of the cases under President Moi. And I think we can agree that it was a repressive environment, but I think there's interesting deviations that I highlighted that are maybe in the minority, but help reinforce this point. Professor Mwangi's question, thanks for this about the accidental president. I think this is quite interesting. Should we think about this? The challenge is some of the mysteries around the succession persisted today. So for example, We know that there were challenges to President Moi, or to Vice President Moi, actually succeeding power. There's a change the constitution movement. There were some recent things that I've been reading the last couple of years in the nation that have come out that suggest that his assured succession on the day that Jomo Kenyatta died was not as smooth as maybe we originally thought it was. So there were certainly cases. So there was certainly, it was not certain that he would be taking power. But on the other hand, unlike many other countries that don't even allow for vice presidents or having a constitutional succession process or having a prime minister or some clear succession plan, there at least was that in the Kenyan case. And it was untested at that point because it hadn't happened yet, or had not been a succession. But technically and constitutionally, the vice president was to take power. So he did, in a way, I wouldn't describe that as an accident. So, and Moi was there for 10 years at least as vice president and was able to accumulate allies and power during that time. So is he an accidental president? I would say no, but it doesn't mean that he's not a weak president, that there's still that a lot of the factors that, were constraints on Vice President Moi then carried over to the presidential period. But thanks for the question. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Since I don't see any hand up, I now want to call the chair of the host department. As I call him, it is to thank you, those who are here both physically and those who are online, for attending this session. My only parting shot, Andrew, is maybe it's already in your study, but how does Moi's loyalty to President Kenyatta, if at all it was loyalty or it was fear, I don't know what it was, how does it impact when he becomes president on how he treats those who now become loyal to him? And you can juxtapose that against, within President Kenyatta's loyalists, there were those who were against Moi, there were those who were for Moi, those very loyalists to him who wanted him to succeed, as Peter Mwangi tells us, becomes the defectors. What's playing out here? And how does it create a path for us to study future dictators and loyalists? Dr. Mbongi.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Andrew, add into that the fact that Moi himself said this at some point to his detractors that when I was Kenyatta's vice president, I followed his footsteps. I repeated what he said like a parrot. I will want you to do the same thing to me. If I'm paraphrasing, you know, but he said that at the end. And then we are seeing a man who did not have the eloquence of Martin Joseph Sikuku. You know, he did not have the sophistication and education of Mwai Kibaki or Charles Njonjo, and he did not have the wealth of Njenga Karume. But then he becomes president. There's some accident there. I don't know. As we say in Kenya, kuna ka accident yapo. I don't know, but think about it. Yeah. Now, friends, we can go on and on. You know, we have actually gone beyond 15 minutes beyond our time. And Andrew, that shows how interesting this conversation is. And you know, no words of mine, no words of any colleagues from the department can thank you enough for agreeing to come to share with us in this forum. Thank you, Andrew, so much for this. And I feel very enriched. And I guess our PhD and master's students I'm seeing here, you picked a few ideas that can help you, you know, come up with your topics for research and all that. So thank you very much, Andrew. And I also want to thank your partner for coming along and supporting you. I'm beginning to envy you with that kind of support. Now, secondly, our moderator and discussant, thank you, Prof. You know, Andrew talked about the power of classmates. Here we are. Adams and I we are contemporaries, and we were classmates here during our bachelor's. He went the political science way in his postgraduate. I went the history way, and here we are. So when I call upon him, he has no choice but to answer. We have done so many things together with Adams in research and in many other activities. I hope, Adams, one day we will have time to write our memoirs and say the things we have done together. It's only God who knows. Thank you very much for heeding my call. This discussion was supposed to be done by the young Oscar Otele, who was Adams's student. But then he's occupied somewhere else, and he fell back to his teacher. And when his teacher realized that it's a classmate calling, he responded. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would also like to really, thank our online participants for waiting very patiently. You know, waiting for 2 hours online is not something easy, especially those in the United States who had to wake up very early. And I saw a colleague from South Korea. I think he has stayed up late to watch this. On-site participants, we have had many colleagues, here from the department, our MA students, colleagues from the department. I can see Malim Pamela Ngesa, my own teacher, also still holding on here. Thanks, Malim. The lady who asked you about whether dictators are made or born, there you are. I would also like to appreciate and recognize and acknowledge our visitors. Dr. Anais Angelo from University of Vienna in Austria, who is affiliated to the department currently. Thank you and welcome. My very good friend, Professor Sean Elam from the United States, please welcome. And I saw online our senior scholars, Susan Muela, who was part of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, a greater part of the 70s and I think 80s. And also our senior archaeologist, Professor Simiu Wandiba was in, who is part and parcel of us in the department in some ways, still supervising some of our students. So with all that, friends, I also saw, without forgetting, people from outside the academy. I actually saw the MD of MultiChoice, DSTV of Africa and Middle East, Mr. Stevie Sabok online, and looks like he's taking interest in history. So Steve, welcome again. I don't know whether you've left, but I saw you online. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you very much. See you in 2 weeks when we are going to talk about tourism. We have a colleague from Germany presenting something on tourism in 2 weeks. Thank you and God bless you.